All right, today we're talking about the Harlem Renaissance. And today's objective question is, why was what happened in Harlem called a Renaissance? Well, in order to answer that question, we first need to understand what a Renaissance is. A Renaissance is typically used to describe the rebirth or revival of something, or otherwise a renewed interest in something. So our question for today is, why was what happened in Harlem a rebirth or a revival? All right, well, let's start with what the Harlem Renaissance was. The Harlem Renaissance was a flowering of Black culture that occurred during the 1920s. This is going to help kind of re-identify the identity of African Americans in our country. This is going to be a chance for them to establish what it means to be African American in our country at this time. And it occurs in a place called Harlem, which is a neighborhood in New York City, which is why it's called the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance includes new art, new music, new literature, new ideas. Some major philosophers who are going to become very important in the coming era are all going to begin here in the Harlem Renaissance. Now, why is this actually occurring? Well, for starters, we have a large population of African Americans now living in the North, and this is because of a concept called the Great Migration, which we talked about in an earlier unit. The Great Migration occurred for a couple different reasons. One, better opportunity, safer environment, because a lot of these people are fleeing from the South, which, remember, is rooted in Jim Crow and strict segregation and stuff like that. They also, remember, are moving northward because of a large opportunity during World War I, where a lot of white men have left and relocated to the front of the war, and African Americans are going to fill those spaces. So there's a lot of different reasons these African Americans are in the North now, and that's going to contribute to that. And then, of course, once they're there, and once they're establishing, these African American communities, and once people are getting together and talking more, word spreads that up in North, specifically Harlem, there's a lot of African-American, camaraderie going on, and that's going to encourage even more people to come and arrive and establish themselves in the North. We're also going to see the formation of some different African-American groups like the NAACP and some movements there that we'll talk about in detail tomorrow. Where is this occurring? In Harlem, of course. The statistic right here is great. Of almost 250,000 African Americans who moved to the North, almost 175,000 of them moved to Harlem. Harlem is a small little neighborhood. You see right here on this map right here, on the peninsula of Manhattan. It's only 3 miles long. So you've got 175,000 additional African Americans moving up here to this 3-mile, square area. And at its peak, this is going to be the largest concentration of Black people in the world, which helps Harlem become known as the Negro capital of the world, because there are so many there and they are such a large majority in that region. Here we see once again the boroughs of New York City. We've got Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and then Manhattan here, that little island. And then right at the top of that island, we see Harlem. So that's the area we're talking about. The win, of course, is the 1920s, right? This is post-World War I, when everybody is, dabbling in new art forms and stuff like that. So we're going through the, who, what, when, where, how, right? So the who's are, artists. These are African-American artists who are painting and celebrating in a new style. We've got some poets and writers going on. The poets and writers of the Harlem Renaissance focus primarily on 2 major themes. The first being the impact of slavery on African Americans in our country. So talking about, the way they've been disadvantaged, talking about the way that they've grown since then, and then also the idea of combating stereotypes. Remember that a lot of people in our country at this point have certain ideas in their mind of what African Americans are like and what they're capable of and what they can do. And the Harlem Renaissance is about challenging that and changing the minds of people who are open to that. We also see musicians and stuff like that, people playing new types of music like jazz and swing, and also philosophers. This man right here, W.E.B. Du Bois, we've done a reading by him already, and we'll talk about him a lot more tomorrow. The who of the Harlem Renaissance, African Americans in the North, specifically in Harlem, of course, but they're going to, you know, begin to express themselves differently. So women during this time are going to begin to dress in flapper styles, just like the other women we've already talked about in the 1920s. Sometimes this involves shorter skirts. Specifically, the Harlem Renaissance revolves around silk stockings. A lot of times are going to be worn by African American women during this time period. And another really popular aspect is leopard print. Leopard print skyrockets in popularity in Harlem around this time period because African Americans view that, specifically women, as a way to be closer to their African roots and styles and stuff like that. So it's kind of a homage back to Africa and where they've come from. Men, on the other hand, are going to wear these things right here called zoot suits. Zoot suits are large, they're oversized. You can see that his jacket goes all the way down to where we can presume his knees are. His pants are very baggy here. We've got large shoulder pads, large lapels taking up a lot of area here. And then both men and women are going to love the style of wide-brimmed hats. So just a few elements there. Let's look at some art. We see here some interesting style, right? African-American focused, of course. Very nice. Here we see not only African-American subjects, but they're doing things that are popular during the Harlem Renaissance, like dancing and jazz music and stuff like that. Here we see some more examples. Some more. Also, remember we talked about in the 1920s, we have leisure time, we have sports, we have the creation of baseball and stuff like that, and African Americans are going to get in on that as well. Remember that because of Jim Crow, everything, or not just Jim Crow, Plessy v. Ferguson, right? Everything's segregated. Sports are no different. African Americans who want to play in the baseball league are going to have to form their own, and they do. There's a Negro baseball league that's very prominent during this time period, and the Black New York Yankees are going to be, of course, the black version of the New York Yankees that have established prior to them. So we've got that going on. The effects of the Harlem Renaissance, let's talk about a few of them. African American artists and writers are going to begin to be respected not just throughout our country, but also on an international level. Other people are taking notice of what's going on here, which is great. We also see that some non-African, those AA means non-African American, right? We have white composers and artists and musicians who are going to begin to borrow from some of these new styles they see in Harlem, the jazz, the swing, stuff like that. So that's cool. We have a change of perception for some. Of course, majority of Americans are not going to change their minds here, whether that be for the good or for the bad. But, you know, the predominant opinion prior to the Harlem Renaissance was that African Americans were uneducated farmers. And part of that being that was, for the most part, a lot of what they were, you know, only allowed to do. After the Harlem Renaissance, African Americans are viewed by some as more sophisticated, more intellectual. There are, of course, people in the South who are never going to change their mind, right? But this is a step in the right direction for public opinion on what African Americans are really capable of and how wowed we are by them. The two last ones, probably the most important, that Harlem Renaissance is going to allow for African Americans to pretty much for the first time openly celebrate and embrace their heritage. You know, this is not a new concept of being, you know, proud of where you've come from and stuff like this, but the idea that they're openly allowed to celebrate it is going to be really powerful for them. And then, of course, this last one underlined for emphasis, right? African Americans are going to be able to establish an identity for themselves for the first time in America. Up until this point, for the most part, white people have had a say in African American lives and to an extent their culture and stuff like that. No more is that solely the case. African Americans can decide for themselves what it means to be black, and not just what it means to be black, but also black in America. And they set their own rules and limits and boundaries and styles and culture, and it's a really big shift we've got here. So why is this referred to as a Renaissance? Well, what we have is the rebirth of African American culture, right? And we also have a revival in some of the, you know, throwback styles. Leopard print, for an example, is a way we're going to revive some of our past. Cool. The last thing right here is a great little recap video if you want to watch that as well. But that's it.